Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be discussing my burgeoning poetry collection, my experience reading poetry this year. I really haven't read much poetry in the past. It's kind of a new development in my reading. In a vlog I did earlier this year in the summer, I bought this book, The Complete Poems of Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson is a, very famous poet, perhaps one of the most famous American poets ever. She happens to be a local hero, I guess, and I went to her house in Amherst, Massachusetts last year. Just the fact that I live so close to where Emily Dickinson grew up, did most of her writing, and lived and died really inspired me to get into poetry. I previously in high school, I read poetry for English. I want to say AP Literature. I took both AP Literature and AP Lang. And I think I took AP Literature my senior year. We did a lot of poetry reading in that class. I remember reading some Edna St. Vincent Millay, among other poets that are escaping me at the moment. I actually really loved reading poetry, but I've always found it difficult to sit down and read through a poetry book. There was something about that I found elusive. I don't know, maybe it's just maturing as a reader, as a person, but when I started reading poetry this year, starting with Emily Dickinson, I found it a lot easier than I remembered to really sit with a poem, meditate on it. I found it really beautiful. Something that I started doing was using poetry as a journaling prompt almost. Previously, I've been a big journaler, especially in high school. I used to journal a lot. I've fallen out of the habit. I think part of it is that nowadays, if I journal and write about my day, I tend to be very anxious and I will start writing, and writing out my thoughts actually weirdly works against helping my anxiety, making my anxiety into a tangible thing once I've written it down. And it's almost better for me to not focus on what I've been mulling over or worrying about, just focus on something else. And so what I'm trying to get to is that I started doing this journaling practice where I will read a poem, and usually it's been out of Emily Dickinson's work, open this book up to just a random page. And the beauty of Emily Dickinson's poetry is that it tends to be really short. And so I'll just open it up to a random page and select a poem, copy it down verbatim, and really try to pay attention to the line breaks and any capitalizations and just write down the poem. I found that it has been such a helpful and wonderful journaling practice to do that. Once I've written down the poem, copied it over into my journal, I will read it over a couple times and reflect on it. Sometimes I'll do something akin to like a close reading, but most of the time I just read the poem over and over. It helps me to reflect on my life, because a lot of Emily Dickinson's poetry, because I'm like reading it randomly, it'll give me something that is completely random. Sometimes they're about nature, sometimes they're about death and mortality, sometimes they're about very existential poems about her finding herself, or sometimes they're just about her expressing depression. I find that the randomness and the act of copying down the poem has really helped me to reset my own mind. It gets it off thinking about whatever it was I was mulling about, makes me reflect on a deeper, truer emotional state that I'm in. So I just wanted to share that. I've been doing that in this notebook that I got from Marshall's. I just bought this notebook randomly and I had no plans for using it. Such a beautiful journal. I'm really happy that I started doing this. Just a really wonderful way to use up any notebooks you have. I know a lot of people tend to buy really nice notebooks and then you're like, what am I going to put in this? I would highly recommend. I've been doing this since September, I think it was, when I started doing this, and it's been really lovely. I'm looking at my journal now, and I guess I actually started this with Ursula K. Le Guin's book, which brings me to my next book in my collection. It's called So Far So Good, and this is Ursula K. Le Guin's final work. In the introduction, it says that she delivered this to her publisher on January 15, 2018, and she died on January 22nd. And so these poems are really her final word, her final message to her readers. Something that's different about the way that I read poetry is this is such a short book. I have been reading this since September. I've been working my way through these poems, and the thing that I find about poetry is that I could read one tiny little poem 50 different times, still have something more to think of, something more to ponder. And it's so different from the way that I read books, because if this was a book that I was reading that was this short, I would have finished it and long forgotten it. But poetry really beckons me to slow down and just mull things over in a really productive way. Poetry has really become a way for me to reflect on life, and a lot of the poems in this book, particularly by Ursula K. Le Guin, are meditations. I think there's actually a section called meditations, but a lot of them are just these tiny poems capturing a portrait of nature. There's several that are about this place called McCoy Creek, which I don't know where that is, but I feel like I know it so well because Le Guin has so many different poems talking about McCoy Creek and describing the basalt ridges and the wind and the cows. Yeah, it's been such a wonder to read this poetry collection, and there is a definite sense of melancholy to this poetry collection, it being her final work. And I find it really emotional reading this. I will often be reading a poem and I will find myself tearing up. I want to actually read the first poem because I think it will illustrate what I mean by the sort of gravity to this poetry collection that I feel when I read it. First section is called Observations, and the first poem is called Little Grandmother. A dry-voiced chickadee reproves what's gone amiss. From our crabapple tree, she gazes critically at autumn's entropy and quietly says this: I am chickadee, and things have gone amiss. I find that poem so heavy emotionally because it's Le Guin herself as this chickadee sounding the alarm that something has gone wrong. Her writing this towards the end of her life, she's looking around the world. Did she feel the sense of remorse or regret or just sadness that the world was in a bad state? You know, she's leaving behind her children. Yeah, I don't know if I'm making sense when I'm talking about this, but I've been loving reading this poetry collection, and it makes me think of mortality, of nature, the beauty of the world. And that all sounds very generic. I'm really new to talking about poetry, so I'm trying my best to convey the magnitude of things that poetry makes me feel, and it's really difficult. If I were better at it, I would just be a poet, because I think poets have such a way with words, and they can capture these feelings in such a small amount of space. And that's something that I keep coming back to with these poems, is they are so short, and yet I feel like I need to dwell on them for so long to just understand them and fully experience what they're trying to say. And there's so much there to think about. So I showed you all my Ursula K. Le Guin. This is my Emily Dickinson collection. I also have this Walt Whitman book that actually my fiance got, but this is in my bookshelf for now. And I guess I will maybe be interested in Walt Whitman as well. Since I have it, I will definitely be reading this at some point. And then my next two books are very serendipitous because I actually did not plan this. I was going to talk about poetry today. I have this John Keats complete poems, and then I have this new book that I just got from my friend Evie, and she is the one who gifted me both of these books. We got this together when we went on a little bookstore crawl and we did a book haul together, and she got this for me. And I haven't read any of the John Keats books yet. I thought that I would kind of do what I've been doing with Emily Dickinson, where I open up to a random page because it's like a completed poems, and just like read a random poem here and there, but John Keats poems are a lot longer, so I can't really do my journaling practice. I think I just need to like read these in order as a poem instead of doing my what I do with the Emily Dickinson poems. But I'm very excited to get to Keats. Thank you, Evie. Yesterday this arrived in the mail, and it's Florence Welch's poetry collection as well as her lyrics. I was thinking of this yesterday actually because I was in the car listening to Miss Jackson by Outkast, and I was just thinking about how lyrics I take for granted. I take so for granted how poetic and important lyrics are. Even though I haven't read poetry all my life, I've listened to music pretty much all my life, and lyrics are so important. So I'm really excited to have this book and think of Florence Welch's work in a different context and really appreciate the words by themselves. I'm so excited to have this. Thank you, Evie, for sending this to me, and it's been really, really fun to listen to Florence Welch's new album, Everybody Scream, with Evie, and discussing it with people, because it is such a word forward album, as opposed to some of Welch's earlier music that I felt was more like dancey. And I think her lyrics have always been very important to her work, and they've always had this very distinct gothic, ghostly, witchy aesthetic to them, and she delves deeper into that and uses that aesthetic to express so much pain and just create this very interesting dialogue in her new album. I'm really, really excited to have these two books in my collection, so thank you, Evie. Finally, my last poetry book is this one by Mary Oliver, and I'm actually doing a online course thing where they are reading through Mary Oliver's devotions. Mary Oliver is a really famous poet. I was really excited to do this online course because it's been so long since I've ever been in a classroom setting where I was learning literature or English or poetry in a formal way. So it's been really fun. We had our first class this past Wednesday, and I just learned so much from people discussing the poetry. I got so much more than just like sitting and reading by myself, and I'm really glad that I signed up for it. A couple of her poems are just like really TikTok famous, and I've seen them on Instagram Reels and always felt that same gravity that I feel when I read Ursula K. Le Guin's poetry. And so I jumped on the opportunity to dig a little deeper into Oliver's work in a more formal setting. I would say that Oliver and Le Guin have a lot of similarities in their subject matter. They write a lot about nature, divinity of nature, I want to say. And it's been very interesting to see how, even though they write very similar things, how distinct both of their poetry actually does read. Despite being poetry, how the author's voice really comes through and creates this distinct style. So yeah, this is my entire poetry collection. Maybe not as extensive as some other people's, but I'm very excited about my recent poetry diversions, and I would love to hear from you all what poetry you read, any recommendations you have. If you are interested in hearing me talk more about poetry, I would love to do more of that. Like I said, I find it a little difficult to talk about poetry because for me it's such an emotional experience reading it. I'm not really thinking about putting it into words all the time and communicating that, but I love discussing everything on BookTube. Yeah, let me know. Recommendations, thoughts on different poets. I'm all ears. That's all I've got for this week. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, take care.